The first thing that broke the night wasn't fear. It was the quiet, the kind that presses against your ears until you start listening for things you don't want to hear. My name is Ethan Crowell. I was 37 that fall, old enough to trust my instincts, young enough to still challenge them. I'd grown up in eastern Kentucky, hiking ridgelines with my father before cancer took his voice and then the rest of him. Camping was never about escape for me. It was about remembering how to stand still in places that didn't care if I existed. That's what brought me to Roan Mountain alone in a faded 1978 Volkswagen Westphalia I'd rebuilt with my own hands. Beige paint, dented side panel, engine that rattled like it was clearing its throat every time I asked too much of it. I parked just off a narrow access spur near the Appalachian Trail, a place locals warned me about with half smiles and unfinished sentences. No reservations, no cell signal, just elevation, wind, and trees old enough to outlive whatever stories people told about them. I set my camp simple. Pop top up. Lantern low. No fire, wind was wrong for it. The air smelled damp and mineral, like crushed leaves and cold stone. By 10:30, fog had started to slide down hills, threading between the spruce trunks like it had somewhere to be. I told myself it was normal. Mountain weather always is, until it isn't. By 11, the temperature dropped fast. Not a gentle cool, but a sudden tightening, like the forest pulling a coat around its shoulders. I zipped my jacket, sat on the rear bumper of the van, and listened. Wind, leaves, a branch cracking somewhere far off. All of it reasonable, all of it explainable. That's the danger, I'd later realize. How long the mind will protect you with logic, even when logic is the first thing that should leave. I crawled into the tent I'd pitched a short distance from the van, habit, not necessity. I liked sleeping outside when I could, liked the thin wall between me and everything else. The ground was cold through the pad. I lay there counting breaths, letting the forest settle around me. Just after midnight, the whistling began. Not a tune, no melody, just a single sharp note. High, clean, almost mechanical. It came from uphill first, somewhere beyond the tree line. One whistle, a pause, then another, farther to the right. I held my breath without meaning to. It didn't sound like a bird, didn't sound like wind through a hollow branch. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I waited for a follow-up, some natural explanation to reveal itself, but instead the sound repeated, same note, same length, this time closer. I told myself people hike late. Told myself someone might be signaling a friend. I reached for my headlamp and flicked it on. The forest froze. The beam cut through fog and bark and nothing else. No movement, no sound. The whistling stopped so cleanly it felt like someone had put their hand over my mouth instead of theirs. I waited a full minute before switching the light off. The whistle came again. Behind me now, closer. I sat up, heart ticking faster than my thoughts. My breath fogged the air inside the tent, thick and loud. I turned my head slowly, trying to triangulate, but the sound didn't belong to a place. It belonged to intent. It moved when I moved, adjusted when I listened too hard. I clicked the headlamp on again. Silence. I stayed like that for a long time, light burning, eyes stinging, muscles locked. When nothing happened, I laughed, quietly, bitterly. Fear has a way of making you angry at yourself before it makes you careful. Eventually, I shut the light off. The whistle answered immediately. Not closer this time, nearer, as if distance had stopped applying. I whispered out loud, no, like the word could enforce a boundary. Another whistle came from downhill, then another to my left. Call and response. A pattern forming around me. My skin prickled, not with panic yet, but with something heavier. Recognition without memory. Like my body knew this situation even if my mind refused to name it. I thought about my father then. About the way he used to stop mid-step on the trail, hand raised, listening. The woods talk, he'd say. Most folks just don't know when they're being spoken to. I reached for the headlamp again and stopped. Something shifted inside the tent. Not movement. Pressure. The thin nylon wall at my back dimpling inward, just slightly, as if someone had leaned a finger against it and decided not to push. The whistle came again. This time, it came from inside the tent. I screamed. a raw, involuntary sound that tore out of my chest before I could shape it. I rolled forward, slammed the headlamp on, and scrambled for the zipper. Nothing was there. The tent was empty, my gear untouched. No footprints, no torn fabric, just me, shaking so hard my teeth clicked, light bouncing wildly across dirt and shadow. I burst out into the night, gasping, lungs burning. The fog had thickened, swallowing the beam of my lamp after 10 feet. My Volkswagen loomed through it like a grounded animal, familiar and suddenly fragile. The whistling didn't stop. It circled now, not fast, not slow, patient. I ran to the van, tripped over a root, skinned my palm, didn't feel it. Threw the side door open and dove inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked it once, twice, like metal could negotiate with whatever was outside. I killed the headlamp and sat in darkness, listening. The whistles grew softer, closer together. Less directional, as if the forest itself had learned how to breathe through pursed lips. Then something brushed the side of the van. Not a strike. Not an impact, just a gentle drag along the panel I'd repaired myself, fingers, or something shaped like them, testing the surface, memorizing it. My mouth went dry. My mind tried again to rationalize. Deer, wind-blown branch, anything. A whistle answered from directly behind my seat, inside the van. At 12:36 a.m., something in the darkness learned my breath. I covered my mouth, heart hammering so loud I was sure it could hear me. The smell inside the van, oil, old fabric, my own fear, felt suddenly invasive, like I was the wrong thing in the wrong place. And that was when I realized the whistling wasn't calling to me anymore. It was waiting for me to answer. The silence after that realization was worse than the sound itself. I don't know how long I sat there, hunched in the driver's seat of that old Volkswagen, knees pulled up, hands clamped over my mouth like I could physically hold myself inside my body. Time lost its shape. My watch glowed faintly when I finally dared to look, 12:41 a.m., but it didn't feel like minutes had passed. It felt like the night had folded in on itself, trapping me in a pocket where clocks were suggestions, not rules. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, blurring the world into pale motion. I strained to hear footsteps, branches snapping, anything solid. Instead, the whistling returned, not sharp now, not testing. It softened, rounded at the edges, almost curious. One note held a fraction longer than before. Then silence, then another, closer to the driver's door. My chest tightened with an old, familiar guilt. I had ignored my instincts. Again. Just like I'd done the night my father insisted on hiking one last ridge, even though the storm clouds were wrong, the wind too sudden. I remembered how I'd followed him anyway, trusting experience over unease, logic over that quiet internal alarm. He'd slipped that night, fallen hard, lived long enough to apologize for not listening to the woods. I swallowed hard and forced myself to think. Panic wouldn't get me off this mountain. Movement might. I reached for the keys, metal clinking softly in my shaking hand. The sound felt enormous. The whistle answered immediately, right outside the windshield now. Not loud, not aggressive, just there. I slid the key into the ignition as slowly as I could, breath shallow. The van hesitated when I turned it over, engine coughing once, twice. I begged it silently, every word I'd never said to my father packed into that plea. The engine caught. The sound shattered the forest's patience. Whistles erupted from every direction at once, uphill, downhill, so close they rattled the glass. Not angry, excited, like a crowd reacting to movement on a dark stage. Something thumped against the passenger side panel hard enough to rock the van. Then another thud near the rear. I slammed the headlights on. The beams cut through fog and revealed nothing. No shapes, no bodies, just trees, pale and still, standing too close together to be comforting. I shifted into reverse and felt resistance immediately, like the tires were sunk deeper than they should have been. The ground outside wasn't mud. I'd checked. Gravel and packed earth. But the van strained, whining as if something heavy had leaned its weight against it. A whistle cut through the engine noise, sharp again, right beside my ear. I screamed and punched the accelerator. The tires broke free with a violent jolt, gravel spraying. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I steered blindly down the spur road, headlights shaking, fog swallowing distance. The whistling followed, not fading, not chasing, but pacing me, matching speed through the trees. Then the road dropped suddenly, a steep decline I didn't remember. The van lurched, suspension groaning. I smelled hot oil, burning rubber. My hands slipped on the wheel, slick with sweat. And then, silence. The whistling stopped all at once. No gradual fade, no echo. Just gone. I didn't slow down until the road leveled out and the forest thinned, replaced by a wide gravel turnout near a locked service gate. I killed the engine and sat there in the dark, chest heaving, ears ringing with the absence of sound. When I finally dared to step out, the air felt different, warmer. Still dangerous, but in a way I recognized. The fog lingered, but it no longer pressed inward. It drifted. I walked around the van with my headlamp on, scanning the panels. That's when I saw the marks, not scratches, not dents, handprints. They covered the side of the Volkswagen in uneven patterns, smeared across the dust and grime. Too many. Overlapping, some large, some smaller. All wrong in the same way. Fingers too long, palms stretched thin, as if whatever made them hadn't quite learned the proportions yet. None of them looked human. My knees buckled and I had to lean against the van to stay upright. I didn't cry. Fear had burned past tears and settled into something colder, heavier. Understanding. The woods hadn't been trying to scare me away. They'd been listening. I slept in the driver's seat that night with the engine off and the doors locked, every light extinguished. I didn't hear the whistling again, but I dreamed of it, of breath learning my rhythm, of sound practicing my fear. At dawn, I drove straight down the mountain without stopping. I didn't pack the tent. Didn't look back at the campsite. I crossed into North Carolina before my hands stopped shaking. I don't camp alone anymore. Not like that. I choose sites with space, with sightlines. I trust the unease when it rises no matter how inconvenient it feels. Especially then, because some places don't want your company. Some places don't want your fear, they want your attention. And if you listen too long after midnight, the woods might learn how to speak back in your voice. I didn't realize how quiet civilization was until I reached it. The first gas station I stopped at was just outside Bakersville. Lights buzzing, pavement warm under my boots. Trucks idled, a radio played country music through a cracked door, normal sounds, human sounds. And still, my shoulders stayed hunched like I was waiting for the night to lean in close and test me again. I scrubbed my hands in the bathroom sink until the skin burned, watching brown water spiral away, dirt from the mountain, dust from those handprints, or maybe something else. I didn't know anymore. When I looked up at my reflection, my eyes didn't quite line up with who I remembered being. I looked thinner, sharper, like fear had carved something out of me and left the edges exposed. I told no one what happened on Roan Mountain. Not the clerk when she asked if I was okay. Not the friend I called later that morning to say I was cutting the trip short. I used safe words. Weather turned, engine trouble, just didn't feel right. All of it true in the way lies often are, shaped around something too large to hold directly. I drove west for 2 days before I slept in a real bed. Every rest stop made my chest tighten. Every stand of trees along the highway pulled my eyes toward it, searching for movement, for intention. I started noticing how often people whistled without thinking, at dogs, at kids, at nothing at all. Each time, my stomach dropped, and I had to remind myself where I was. Weeks passed, then months. I cleaned the Volkswagen top to bottom, replaced the side panel where the handprints had been, telling myself metal fatigue had weakened it anyway. I threw out the tent, burned the sleeping bag in a barrel behind my garage, watching synthetic fibers curl and blacken, smoke stinging my eyes. It felt necessary, like closing a door. But fear doesn't respect doors. It comes back quietly, wearing familiar clothes. The first time I heard it again, it was spring. I was half asleep on my couch, windows open to let in the night air. Somewhere down the block, someone whistled, one clean, sharp note. Probably a neighbor calling a dog. Probably nothing. My heart slammed so hard I tasted copper. I sat up, counting breaths, listening. The sound didn't repeat. Cars passed. A train horn wailed miles away. Normal reclaimed the moment. I laughed at myself then, a brittle sound and blamed the mountain for leaving a bruise on my nerves. But the second time was harder to dismiss. I was hiking a familiar trail near Red River Gorge, midday, sun high, families nearby, children laughing. I stopped to drink water, leaned against a rock face still cool from morning shade. That's when I heard it. One note. Behind me. Behind me. Not loud, not trying. Testing. I spun around so fast my pack strap cut into my shoulder. Nothing there. Just trees. Just rock. Just a breeze moving leaves in uneven pulses. I stood frozen, eyes burning, until a couple walked past and nodded like everything was fine. I finished the hike in a fog of my own, every sound magnified, every shadow suspect. I started paying attention after that, not with panic. Panic is noisy, but with the same stillness my father used to carry. I noticed how the sound never came in crowded places, how it favored transitions, edges, moments when I was alone but not isolated, when I felt safe enough to stop listening so hard. That realization scared me more than the night on Roan Mountain ever had, because it meant the mountain hadn't followed me, it had marked me. I began researching in ways that didn't leave footprints. Old forums, park ranger anecdotes buried in comment sections, local legends dismissed with humor that felt practiced. Whistlers, callers, mimics. Names varied by region, but the behavior didn't. Sound as invitation. Sound as curiosity. Sound as learning. One post stuck with me. A former thru-hiker writing about how certain stretches of trail felt attentive, like the land itself leaned in when you were vulnerable. He wrote, "The worst thing you can do is respond. The second worst is to pretend you didn't hear." There were no instructions beyond that, no solutions, just warnings shaped like memories. I stopped hiking for a while after that, told myself it was temporary, told myself I needed rest. But the truth sat heavier. I didn't trust myself to listen correctly anymore. I didn't know if ignoring the sound was strength or denial. And denial had already cost me once. It took nearly a year before I returned to the woods with intention. I chose a campground with open sightlines, ranger presence, other campers nearby. I arrived early, walked the perimeter, learned the rhythm of the place before dark could rewrite it. I didn't pitch a tent, slept in the van, windows cracked just enough to hear, not to invite. That night, lying on my back, I felt the old tension coil in my chest as darkness settled. Every instinct screamed to leave, to put miles between me and trees. Instead, I stayed, listened, crickets, wind, distant laughter, all of it imperfect, human, alive. No whistling came, but some did, understanding. The mountain hadn't been malicious, not in the way stories like to paint. It hadn't chased me, hadn't attacked, it had observed. Tested boundaries, responded to curiosity the way a wild thing does, by pushing back, gently at first, then harder when ignored. I'd mistaken solitude for invisibility. That was the lesson that stayed with me. Not fear of the woods, but respect for attention. The environment isn't passive. It isn't background. It notices how you move through it, how loudly you think, how willing you are to listen without needing to answer. I still camp, still hike, still park the Volkswagen at trailheads and breathe in air that smells like pine and stone and old rain. But I never whistle anymore. Not for dogs, not for people, not for myself. And when I hear a single sharp note carried on the wind, when it happens, because sometimes it still does, I don't run. I don't respond. I stand still, lower my gaze, and let the sound pass through me like weather, because some things don't want to hurt you. They want to know if you've learned when to stay silent. I thought I understood silence after that. I thought I'd earned it. Years passed in a way that felt earned, steady, careful, deliberate. I rebuilt routines the same way I rebuilt engines, one system at a time, testing each part before trusting it. I stopped chasing isolation and started choosing presence. I camped with friends. I checked in with rangers. I learned the difference between solitude and exposure. And for a long time, that was enough. Then my mother died. It wasn't sudden. It was the slow kind of leaving that gives you too much time to prepare and still finds a way to hollow you out. After the funeral, after the casseroles and the quiet phone calls, I found myself standing in my garage with the Volkswagen's keys in my hand, knuckles white, heart pulling me somewhere I didn't want to name. Grief does that. It drags you back to places where you once felt small enough to be held by something bigger. I told myself I wouldn't go back to Roan Mountain. I meant it. I chose a different stretch of the Appalachian Trail, farther south, lower elevation, familiar to me. A place I'd walked dozens of times with my father when I was young, before illness slowed him, before silence took him in stages. I arrived in late October. Leaves brittle underfoot, air clean enough to hurt. The kind of cold that sharpens memory instead of dulling it. I parked the van, shut the door gently, and stood there listening. Not with fear, not with expectation, just listening. Nothing answered. That night I slept deeper than I had in years. No dreams, no echoes, just darkness and breath and the quiet reassurance of being exactly where my feet were. It was just before dawn when I woke, not to sound, but to the absence of it. The forest had gone still in that unnatural way that doesn't belong to night or morning. No birds, no wind, no insects finishing their last conversations, just a held breath stretched too long. I sat up slowly, heart already adjusting to a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Grief has a frequency, so does fear. They're closer than people admit. I stepped out of the van, boots crunching softly on frost. The sky was pale, undecided. Fog lingered low between the trees, not moving, not advancing, just present. I told myself this was nothing, that stillness happens, that I knew better than to read intention into quiet. That's when I heard it. One whistle, not sharp, not testing, tired. It came from far off, somewhere downhill, stretched thin by distance and terrain. It wasn't calling me. It wasn't circling. It sounded like something finishing a thought. I didn't freeze this time, didn't panic. My hands shook, but I let them. I stood there, breath visible, grief heavy in my chest like an open door. "I hear you," I said, not loud, not soft, just honest. The words surprised me as much as anything else that morning. The forest didn't respond, the whistle didn't repeat, but the stillness eased, slowly, carefully, like something stepping back after realizing it had come too close. Birds resumed, wind moved through branches, the world exhaled. I packed up and left without rushing, without looking over my shoulder. The road out was clear, the van ran smooth. The sun rose behind me, turning fog into gold instead of warning. I haven't heard the whistle since. Not while hiking, not while camping, not drifting through half-sleep with the windows open and my guard down. But I don't tell myself it's gone. I don't believe in endings like that. What I believe now is simpler and harder. Some places listen because they've been listened to too long. Some sounds exist not to lure, but to measure. Attention, respect, humility. And some moments in your life tune you to frequencies you'll never quite forget. I carry that with me, not as fear, as awareness. When the woods go quiet, I stop moving. When sound behaves strangely, I don't chase meaning. When my instincts rise, I don't argue with them anymore. And when night settles in deep places, after midnight, when the world thins and the line between inside and outside blurs, I stay silent. Because the most dangerous mistake I ever made wasn't camping alone. It was believing the forest was empty. And if you ever find yourself out there, far from roads, far from voices, standing in a place that feels like it's paying attention, remember this. You don't need to answer every sound. You don't need to prove you're brave. You don't need to see what's watching. Sometimes survival is knowing when to listen and when to let the night pass without giving it your voice. I knew something was wrong the moment the forest went quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath and waiting to see if you notice. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I was 36 that fall, born and raised in Western North Carolina, the kind of guy who grew up believing the woods were honest. Animals made noise when they were there. Wind moved leaves when it passed through. If something sounded human, it usually was. I trusted those rules the way some people trust religion. That trust is what led me to shelter number 7. I'd been section hiking the Appalachian Trail for 3 days, moving north along the spine of Shenandoah National Park. October had stripped the trees bare enough to see the ridgelines stacking into the distance like ribs. The air smelled of wet leaves and iron-rich soil, and every breath felt sharpened by cold. I'd planned to push farther that day, but my knee, an old injury from a construction accident, started burning by late afternoon. Pride lost the argument. I checked the map and saw the shelter just off the trail, less than half a mile downhill. I remember hesitating when I saw it. Shelter No. 7 sat in a shallow bowl of trees, lower than the surrounding ground, like the land had gently pressed it down. The structure itself was older than most I'd stayed in, rough-hewn logs darkened by decades of weather, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. It smelled wrong before I even stepped inside. Not rot, not mildew. Something metallic, faint but persistent, like old rainwater trapped in rusted pipes. Inside, the light was dim, even with my headlamp on. The beam caught scratches on the wooden walls, long, uneven marks that looked too deliberate to be from animals. I told myself it was hikers messing around, carving lines out of boredom. I told myself a lot of things that night. The shelter logbook sat on the left bench, its cover warped from moisture. I flipped through it while my water boiled. Most entries were normal. Trail names, mile counts, jokes about sore feet and bad weather. Then I reached a page near the back where the handwriting changed. Tighter. Pressed harder into the paper. Do not stay here after dark. No signature. No explanation. The next page was blank. I laughed, actually. A short, sharp sound that felt louder than it should have. Trail humor, I decided. Someone trying to mess with the next hiker. Fear travels faster than facts out here, and people know that. By the time I finished eating, the sun had slipped completely behind the ridge. Night settled fast, like a lid being placed over the forest. I hung my food bag, checked my bear spray, and crawled into my sleeping bag on the far bench. The cold seeped up through the wood, biting at my back. I told myself I'd be asleep in minutes. I wasn't. The first thing I noticed was the sound, or rather, the absence of the usual ones. No crickets, no owls. Even the wind seemed to skirt around the clearing, brushing the treetops but never reaching the shelter. My ears strained, searching for something familiar to anchor to. Then came the footsteps. At first, they were faint. Soft compressions like boots on damp earth moving uphill. The rhythm was wrong, not the steady pace of a hiker, but hesitant, uneven, as if whoever was walking kept stopping, listening, then starting again. I sat up, heart ticking faster. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin inside the shelter. The footsteps didn't answer. They kept coming. I swung my legs out of the sleeping bag and stood, headlamp cutting a narrow tunnel through the darkness beyond the shelter's open front. The beam caught nothing but trees and shadow. The footsteps climbed closer, the sound shifting from soil to wood as they reached the steps. One step, then another. I held my breath. The sound stopped. No one appeared. I waited, counting my heartbeats. 10, 20, 30. That's when I noticed the smell. Wet earth, stronger now, mixed with something sour. My nose prickled and a wave of nausea rolled through me. I lowered my light to the floor. A footprint had appeared near the bottom step. Fresh, muddy. I stared at it, my mind scrambling for explanations. Sleep deprivation. Stress. Someone playing a joke. Then another footprint formed beside it, as if pressed down by an invisible weight. The mud was thick, dark, still glistening. The prints moved forward, slowly. One by one, they crossed the wooden floor, each step deliberate, heavy, stopping inches from my sleeping bag. I couldn't move. My body locked in place, every instinct screaming while my brain tried desperately to rationalize what my eyes were seeing. My hands tingled, fingers numb despite the cold not being that severe. I remember thinking, absurdly, about the logbook, about that single sentence, written with such certainty. Do not stay here after dark. The air in the shelter felt thicker, harder to breathe. My headlamp flickered, the beam trembling as my hands shook. I whispered again, barely louder than the forest itself. Who's there? Nothing answered. But I felt it then. Not a presence I could see or hear, but pressure. like standing too close to someone in an elevator. The sense of being observed from inches away, of something leaning in, studying me. My chest tightened. Panic clawed its way up my throat, sharp and hot. I reached for my pack, fingers fumbling for the zipper, every movement sounding impossibly loud. The footprints remained, unmoving now, as if waiting to see what I'd do next. I didn't think. I reacted. I grabbed my pack, kicked free of the sleeping bag, and bolted out of the shelter. The cold hit me like a slap, stealing my breath as my boots hit the ground. I ran without direction, branches tearing at my arms, the beam of my headlamp bouncing wildly. Behind me, I thought I heard movement. Not footsteps this time, but something sliding, dragging, keeping pace without effort. My knees screamed with every step, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The forest felt wrong, distorted, trees leaning in too close, shadows stretching where they shouldn't. My lungs burned, each breath a desperate scrape for air. I didn't stop running until the trail reappeared beneath my feet, the familiar white blaze on a tree snapping into focus like a lifeline. I stood there, bent over, gasping, listening. The forest had found its voice again. Crickets chirped. Wind whispered through leaves. Somewhere far off, an owl called. Nothing followed me out. I didn't go back to shelter number 7. I hiked through the night, knee be damned, until dawn bled gray into the sky and the world felt solid again. Later, when I told a ranger what happened, he listened quietly, his face unreadable. When I finished, he nodded once and said, "You're not the first." He didn't say anything else. I still camp. I still love the woods. But I listen now, to the silence, to the way a place makes me feel before it ever shows me why. Some shelters are just wood and nails, and some are warnings you're only meant to read once. I didn't stop moving until the sky began to lighten, that thin, colorless gray that comes before sunrise when the world feels unfinished. My knee had swollen to the size of a grapefruit, every step a hot pulse of pain, but pain was grounding. Pain meant I was still inside my body. Still here. I reached a small overlook just off the trail and collapsed onto a rock slick with dew. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit on them to make it stop. The forest around me looked normal again, trees standing where they should, shadows behaving themselves, but the sense of being watched hadn't fully left. It lingered like a bad smell in clothing, faint but stubborn. As the sun finally broke through the ridgeline, warmth crept back into my fingers. With daylight came the rational voice I trusted too much. "You panicked," it said. "Exhaustion does things to the brain. Fear fills in gaps." I replayed the night in fragments. The footsteps, the footprints forming out of nothing, the pressure in the air. Each memory felt unreal in the morning light, like scenes from someone else's dream. I told myself I'd go back later, maybe with other hikers around, see if there was a logical explanation. Mud tracked in by an animal. Condensation. Some trick of shadow and stress. But even thinking about turning around made my stomach tighten. I limped on until mid-morning when I reached a road crossing where a trail volunteer was parked, handing out water. He asked about my knee, offered a ride into town. I almost said yes. Instead, I asked him about Shelter 7. His smile faded, not dramatically, just enough to notice. "People don't like staying there," he said carefully. "Why?" He shrugged. "Old shelters get reputations. Stories pile up. You know how it is." I nodded, pretending that was enough. It wasn't. I took the ride into town after all. Pride had finally lost completely. While my knee was being wrapped at a small clinic, my mind kept circling back to that logbook, that single sentence written like a commandment. Do not stay here after dark. Not don't camp. Not be careful. A warning, stripped of comfort. That night, in a cheap motel that smelled of bleach and burnt coffee, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that pressure again, that intimate closeness of something standing just out of sight. I woke drenched in sweat, convinced for half a second that muddy footprints would be waiting beside the bed. In the morning, I made a decision that didn't feel smart, but felt necessary. I went back. I told myself it was about closure, about proving to myself that fear hadn't won. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. Part of me needed to understand what had almost reached out of the dark and touched my life. By the time I hiked back toward Shelter 7, my knee protested with every step, but the forest felt different in daylight. Less hostile, almost indifferent. Birds flitted through branches, sunlight dappled the trail. It was harder now to believe the night before had been real. The shelter came into view just after noon. From the outside, it looked harmless, just wood and age tucked into its shallow bowl. No footprints on the steps, no smell of wet earth. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening to my own breathing. Inside, the logbook was exactly where I'd left it. I flipped back to the warning page. Up close, I noticed something I hadn't the night before. Beneath the sentence, pressed so lightly it was almost invisible, were indentations, words erased hard enough to scar the paper. I angled it toward the light and traced the impressions with my thumb. Slowly, letters emerged in my mind, shaped by pressure rather than ink. It learns who is alone. My mouth went dry. I sat on the bench, heart pounding, and kept turning pages. Deeper into the book, past the cheerful entries, I found more gaps, pages torn out, corners ripped away. Then, near the very back, a cluster of entries written by different hands but with the same tight urgency. Heard footsteps all night. No one there. Something stood at the edge of the shelter, wouldn't come in, wouldn't leave. Woke up to breathing that wasn't mine. The last entry was dated 5 years earlier. I closed the book. That's when I noticed the scratches again. In daylight, they were clearer, layered over each other, some old, some fresh. They weren't random. They radiated inward, all pointing toward the center of the shelter, toward where someone would sleep, toward where I had slept. The temperature dropped suddenly like a cloud passing over the sun, though the light outside didn't change. My breath fogged. The smell returned. Wet earth and metal, stronger now, crawling into my sinuses. I stood up too fast, dizziness washing over me. The air felt heavy again, pressing in on my chest. I wasn't alone. I didn't see it. I felt it. That same closeness from the night before, multiplied now by the certainty of daylight proof. Something was here, occupying space without shape, aware of me in a way that felt personal, curious. The wood beneath my boots creaked. A sound answered from behind me, not a footstep, but a soft, deliberate exhale, right at ear level. I spun around, heart slamming, headlamp forgotten in my hand. There was nothing there, just empty air and old wood. Then the bench across from me groaned under sudden weight. The boards bowed just slightly, as if someone had sat down. My rational mind shattered. Panic surged hot and blinding, every thought reduced to one command: get out. I backed toward the opening, eyes locked on the invisible dent in the bench. The pressure followed, step for step, never touching, never retreating. When my heel hit the top step, I ran. I didn't stop at the trail this time. I didn't stop at the road. I ran until my knee buckled and I fell hard into the leaves, gasping, sobbing, the sound torn out of me without permission. The forest watched in silence, mercifully distant now. I never reported what I found in that logbook. I never asked rangers for explanations I wasn't sure I wanted. Some things I learned don't need names to be real. I finished my hike months later on a different section with different shelters. I still write in logbooks. I still warn people when a place feels wrong. Not with drama, not with stories, just with truth, because the woods don't chase you, they wait. And some shelters aren't built to keep things out, they're built to hold them. I told myself I'd left it behind. That's the lie we use when something follows us quietly enough to pass for memory. Weeks after Shenandoah, I was back home in North Carolina, knee braced, boots drying by the door. Life resumed its shape, workdays, grocery aisles, conversations that stayed on the surface. But at night, when the house settled and the familiar sounds faded, I noticed the same thing I'd noticed at Shelter No. 7. Silence that didn't belong. Not the peaceful hush of sleep, but a listening silence, the kind that waits for you to move first. At 11:18 p.m., every night, without fail, I woke up. I didn't set an alarm. My body just knew. The first few times I laughed it off. Coincidence, stress, my brain replaying fear because fear likes routines. But then I started hearing it. The faintest suggestion of movement, not in the house, but around it. Like someone circling just beyond the reach of sound, testing the perimeter. No footsteps, no doors, just pressure. The same pressure I'd felt inches from my sleeping bag. I stopped hiking for a while, told friends my knee needed more time. The truth was harder to say. I didn't trust myself alone in the woods anymore. Worse, I didn't trust places meant to offer shelter. Enclosed spaces made my chest tighten, cabins, lean-tos. Even my own bedroom some nights. What scared me most wasn't fear itself, it was familiarity. Because a part of me recognized that presence now, not as something new, but as something that had learned me. I broke my own rule one evening and went down a rabbit hole online. Old forums, archived trail journals, ranger incident logs buried beneath cheerful park newsletters. I searched for shelter number 7, then broadened it. Other shelters, other parks, different states. The pattern wasn't obvious at first, it never is, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Shelters near low ground, near water runoff, places where sound behaves strangely, where footsteps echo wrong, where silence stretches too long. Always the same time window, always hikers alone or separated from their group. Always reports that stopped short of explanation. Footsteps with no body, breathing with no mouth, weight without shape, and logbooks. Logbooks with warnings written in different handwriting, different decades, but the same restrained urgency. No hysteria, no exclamation points, as if whatever was happening demanded respect, not panic. One entry from the late 90s stuck with me. It was scanned and blurry but readable. It doesn't follow everyone, it follows the ones who stay. I slept with the lights on after that. Months passed. The nightly waking stopped, slowly at first, then completely. The pressure eased. I began to believe I'd outrun it, that distance and time had done what fear couldn't. Then the email arrived. It was from a guy named Marcus, a thru hiker I'd met briefly years ago in Georgia. We hadn't kept in touch. No reason he should have reached out, except he'd found my name in a logbook. Shelter number 7. Hey man, the email read, "This is going to sound strange, but did you ever stay at a shelter near Shenandoah with a messed up logbook? I think something's wrong, and your entry was the last normal one." I stared at the screen for a long time. He wrote again before I replied. "It's been 3 nights. I haven't slept. I hear it walking up the steps, but it never comes in. Last night, it sat down. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, like hands closing gently around my ribs. I told Marcus not to stay, told him to leave at first light, told him not to wait for answers. He didn't respond right away. When he did, it was just one line. It doesn't like being ignored." That night at 11:18 p.m., my house went quiet. No hum of electricity, no distant traffic. Even the dog down the street stopped barking mid-sound, like someone had closed a door on noise itself. The pressure returned, stronger than before. This time, it wasn't outside. The floorboard at the end of my hallway creaked. Once, then again. Slow. Deliberate. My bedroom door was open. I could see the dark hallway beyond, stretching longer than it should have. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves, though the windows were closed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Something crossed the threshold. Not visibly, but the room reacted. The temperature dropped. The shadows deepened, bending toward the center of the space like they were being pulled. I understood then, with a clarity that felt like grief, that shelter number 7 hadn't been a location. It had been an introduction. Whatever it was didn't belong to the woods alone. The woods were just where it learned patience, where it practiced waiting. Shelters weren't traps, they were classrooms. And I had stayed. The pressure stopped inches from my bed. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight. None of those instincts mattered. This wasn't a thing you escaped with speed or strength. It wasn't chasing me, it was checking if I still remembered. I spoke out loud, voice shaking but steady enough. "I know." The pressure shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Attention sharpened. "I left," I said. "I warned others. I didn't pretend it was nothing." The silence stretched, thin as wire. Then, slowly, the pressure eased. The room warmed. Sound crept back in, the distant car, the hum of power, the world stitching itself together again. The hallway was empty. I slept until morning. Marcus never replied again. I don't know if he left in time. I don't know if leaving is always enough. What I do know is this: some things don't want your fear. They want your acknowledgement. I hike again now. Carefully. I don't stay in shelters that feel wrong no matter how tired I am. And when I write in logbooks, I choose my words with care. Not warnings, not threats. Just truths pressed deep enough to be felt even when erased. Because the woods don't chase you, they introduce you. And some introductions last longer than you think. After that night, I stopped pretending my life had returned to normal. On the surface, it had. I went back to work. I laughed at the right moments. I answered questions about hiking with the practiced vagueness of someone who knows too much and has learned when silence is safer than honesty. But something fundamental had shifted. The world no longer felt neutral. Places carried weight now. Rooms held memory. Silence had texture. And time had habits. I still woke sometimes in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I'd missed the moment. I always checked the clock. When it wasn't 11:18, relief washed through me so hard it left me shaking. When it was close, I sat up and listened, every sense sharpened, not in panic anymore, but in recognition. That was the real change. Fear had burned itself out and left behind vigilance. I went back to the trail the following spring. Not Shenandoah, not anywhere near it. A quieter section in Tennessee, popular enough to keep loneliness at bay, remote enough to feel like the woods again. I told myself I was reclaiming something. Maybe I was. Or maybe I was honoring it properly for the first time. The first shelter I approached that season stopped me cold. Nothing obvious was wrong. No smell, no sudden silence. Birds hopped through the clearing, unconcerned. But the moment I stepped onto the packed dirt floor, my chest tightened, not with terror, but with a low, steady resistance. Like the place itself was saying no. I stepped back. That was new. Before Shelter 7, I would have argued with that feeling, rationalized it, pushed through. That stubbornness had been part of my identity, part of why I loved hiking alone. Out here, grit was currency. You didn't turn back because something felt off. Now I listened. I camped a mile past the shelter under open sky, slept like a stone. That's when I understood the lesson Shelter 7 had carved into me. It wasn't about danger, not really. Whatever lived in that space or moved through it wasn't hunting bodies. It was testing awareness, seeing who trusted the wrong things, who confused endurance with wisdom, who believed shelter always meant safety. The woods don't work that way. Shelters are promises made by humans, not guarantees honored by nature. As the months passed, I noticed something else. The pressure never returned, not in my house, not on the trail, but I sensed echoes of it in other places. Abandoned buildings, empty rest stops late at night, certain motel rooms where the air felt used up, like too many people had passed through, carrying things they didn't drop. I began to think of it not as a single entity, but as a behavior. A phenomenon that formed where conditions allowed it. Silence, isolation, denial, a willingness to stay when instinct said leave. Shelter number 7 had been a perfect convergence. I did one last thing that summer, something I hadn't planned but felt necessary. I drove back to Shenandoah. I didn't hike in. I didn't stay overnight. I parked, walked the trail in daylight, and stopped at the turnoff where the shelter lay downhill. The path was still there, narrow and unassuming, leaves reclaiming its edges. I stood at the top of it for a long time. The forest below looked peaceful, inviting even. Sunlight filtered through branches, painting the ground gold. Anyone passing by would have seen a man pausing to rest, maybe checking his map. What they wouldn't have seen was the quiet exchange happening beneath the surface. I didn't forget, I said softly. Not sure who or what I was speaking to. But I won't come back. The woods didn't answer. They never do. I turned around and walked away without looking back. Later that year, I heard from a ranger I trusted, off the record, over a beer. Shelter number 7 had been dismantled. Official reason, structural decay. Safety concerns. The logs repurposed, the site cleared, the bowl left empty. People like clean endings, causes and solutions, problems removed. but places remember longer than we do. I still hike. I still love the trail. If anything, the love runs deeper now, stripped of naivete. I no longer see the woods as a backdrop for adventure or a proving ground for endurance. I see them as a living system that doesn't care about my expectations and doesn't need my permission to exist on its own terms. When I pass shelters now, I pay attention, not to how tired I am, not to how dark it's getting, but to the way the air behaves when I step inside, to the sounds that linger too long or vanish too fast, to the subtle resistance or welcome that no map can mark. And when something feels wrong, I leave. Every time. I write in logbooks when I stay. Simple entries, dates, weather, gratitude. But sometimes, when a place feels heavy, not dangerous, just burdened, I add a sentence beneath the ordinary words. Not a warning, not a story, just a truth. Listen to yourself here, because that's what shelter number 7 took from me and gave back altered. The belief that I was owed safety if I followed the rules. Out there, rules are suggestions. Awareness is survival, and humility is the only real shelter you carry with you. The woods don't chase you. They don't need to. They wait, they observe, and sometimes, when conditions are right, they teach. The lesson is never the same twice, but it always begins the moment you decide whether to stay. I noticed him because I couldn't hear him. That realization came to me the way cold water creeps up your spine, slow at first, then all at once, while the forest kept breathing around me like nothing was wrong. Leaves crackled under my boots with every step. My pack straps squeaked softly when I shifted my shoulders. Even my own breath sounded too loud inside my head. But somewhere behind me, keeping pace with a precision that felt deliberate, there was a presence that made no sound at all. My name is Caleb Harlan. I was 37 that fall, a North Carolina local who'd grown up believing the mountains were a kind of inheritance, something you could claim just by knowing the trails, by respecting the weather, by listening. I'd spent years RV camping across the country, chasing quiet places, but the Smokies were different. They weren't a destination. They were a memory. My father had brought me here when I was 10, teaching me how to read the ground, how to tell the difference between animal movement and human intent. He died a decade later, and ever since, I'd come back alone when life got too loud. That night, I'd parked my RV near a small trailhead pull-off and decided to hike a familiar stretch before turning in. No rush, no head count, just a headlamp, a light pack, and a trail I'd walked enough times to feel like it recognized me. The sun had gone down clean, no drama, and the woods slipped into darkness the way they always did, gradually, respectfully. At least that's what I told myself. By 9:52 p.m., the forest had changed its tone. The air cooled fast, carrying that wet, metallic smell of decaying leaves and old stone. My headlamp carved a narrow tunnel through the dark, illuminating roots like knuckles breaking through the soil. Every few steps I'd pause, listening the way my father taught me, letting the forest settle, letting my presence fade into the background. That's when I realized something was wrong. I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard footsteps that weren't my own. At first, I dismissed it. The Appalachian Trail is never truly empty. Hikers move quietly at night. Animals pace humans out of curiosity. Your mind fills in gaps when the dark gets thick. I told myself all of that while my shoulders tightened and my pace slowed just enough to test a theory I didn't want to name. The presence behind me slowed too. Not by much, just enough to stay exactly where it was, just outside the halo of my headlamp, where the light thinned into suggestion. I couldn't see a silhouette, couldn't catch the flicker of movement, but I felt it, the way you feel someone standing too close behind you in line, matching your breath without realizing it. I stopped walking. The forest didn't. Crickets kept chirping. A breeze moved through the canopy with a soft, sighing sound. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, then went quiet. But the presence behind me didn't stop. It kept moving forward at the same pace I'd been walking, gliding past the place where I stood frozen, my heart hammering so hard it made my ears ring. I turned fast, sweeping my headlamp in a wide arc. Nothing, just trees. Trunks rising straight and indifferent, branches tangled high above like locked fingers. The trail behind me was empty, its packed dirt unmarred except for my own footprints. No scuff marks, no displaced leaves, no sign that anyone or anything had been there at all. I laughed under my breath, sharp and humorless. Fear has a way of making you feel foolish the moment it loosens its grip. I told myself I was tired, that the day's drive had taken more out of me than I realized. I adjusted my pack and started walking again, faster this time, my boots biting into the trail with deliberate noise. 10 steps in, the feeling returned. Not behind me this time, beside me. To my right, just off the trail, where the ground dipped and rose in uneven folds, I sensed movement that didn't disturb the forest. No snap of twigs, no rustle of brush. Just the unmistakable awareness of parallel motion, matching me stride for stride. I kept my eyes forward, every instinct screaming at me to run, to turn, to do something that would break the pattern. But another part of me, the part that had survived enough close calls to know panic makes mistakes permanent, held me in place. I focused on my breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, controlled. The smell changed. It was subtle at first, a sour note cutting through the clean dampness of the woods. Not rot, not animal musk. Something older, colder, like stone that had never seen the sun. It filled my nose and settled at the back of my throat, making me swallow hard. My skin prickled, the temperature dropping just enough to notice. I pulled my jacket tighter without slowing, my fingers numb despite the mild forecast. The headlamp beam shook with each step, casting shadows that bent and twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. I told myself not to look. I told myself that whatever was there would go away if I refused to acknowledge it. That belief that denial could be a form of control had gotten me through more than one bad night in unfamiliar places. But the Smokies have a way of punishing arrogance, and as the trail curved sharply left, my peripheral vision caught something that made my breath hitch. A shape. Tall. Too tall, moving smoothly between the trees, its outline distorted by distance and shadow. It didn't step over roots or duck beneath branches. It passed through the forest as if the forest weren't there at all. I stopped again, heart in my throat, and this time I forced myself to turn fully, sweeping the light directly toward where I'd seen it. The beam cut through empty air. No figure, no movement, no sound, except the smell, stronger now, clinging to my clothes like damp smoke. I stood there longer than I should have, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. My rational mind scrambled for explanations, optical illusions, uneven terrain, exhaustion, anything that didn't require accepting what my body already knew. I wasn't alone, and whatever was with me didn't move the way living things are supposed to. When I started walking again, it was with purpose. Not panic, purpose. The trailhead was less than a mile back. I could make that in 15 minutes if I kept my pace steady. I didn't need to see the thing to outrun it. I just needed to keep moving. Behind me, or beside me, or everywhere at once, the presence adjusted. It stayed just out of sight, just out of reach, its silence louder than any footstep. And with every step I took toward what I hoped was safety, the forest seemed to lean closer. Branches bending without wind, shadows stretching long and thin across the trail like fingers trying to trip me. That was when I understood the most terrifying part. It wasn't following me, it was walking with me. I realized then that the trail no longer felt like something I was traveling through. It felt like something I was being carried along by, as if the ground itself had decided on a direction and I was just keeping up, afraid that if I stopped again, I wouldn't be allowed to start. My breathing had gone shallow. Every inhale scraped my throat raw, the air cold and wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The smell followed me, stone and damp iron, growing stronger with every step, as if whatever walked without sound was shedding it, or worse, as if the forest itself was exhaling it in response to my fear. I checked my watch without stopping. 10:07 p.m. 15 minutes had passed. It felt like an hour. I tried to ground myself the way I'd learned over years of camping alone. Name what you can feel. boots tight around your ankles, pack weight steady on your shoulders, fingers brushing fabric, the faint vibration of blood in your ears. But every attempt at control unraveled the moment I became aware of something else, something that wasn't physical, wasn't visible, yet felt undeniably close. The trail straightened, opening briefly into a wider corridor where the trees pulled back just enough to reveal the slope falling away to my right. My headlamp beam skimmed over rocks slick with moss, disappearing into darkness below. I slowed despite myself, vertigo curling in my gut, and that's when the silence changed. Not broke, shifted. It was as if the forest had taken a breath and was holding it. No insects, no wind, no distant animal calls. Even my own footsteps sounded muffled now, swallowed by the ground the instant they landed. The presence beside me, because by then I'd stopped pretending it was behind, felt closer. Not touching, never touching, but close enough that the space between us felt charged, like the air before lightning. I spoke without meaning to. "Hey," I said, my voice cracking on the word. The sound felt obscene in the stillness, like I'd violated some unspoken rule. It didn't echo. It didn't fade naturally. It just stopped, cut off as cleanly as if someone had closed a door on it. I waited for a response I didn't want. None came. Instead, the temperature dropped again, sudden and sharp, my breath fogging in front of me despite the season. The smell intensified, making my eyes water. I tasted it now, metallic and bitter, coating my tongue. I picked up my pace, no longer caring about noise or stealth. My boots struck the trail harder. My pack bounced against my spine. I told myself that whatever this was, it couldn't follow me to the road. Things like this belong to places without edges, without boundaries. Civilization, even the thin kind represented by a gravel lot and an RV, had weight. Rules. The trail marker came into view ahead, a reflective white blaze painted on a tree trunk. Relief surged through me so hard it almost brought me to my knees. I was close. Close enough that I could feel the night loosening its grip, just a little. That's when it stepped into the light. Not fully. Not in a way my mind could grab onto and name. But enough. The edge of my headlamp caught movement to my left, a distortion more than a figure, like heat shimmer in cold air. The light didn't reveal it so much as bend around it, the beam curving slightly, shadows warping in ways that made my vision swim. It was tall. That much I knew. Taller than any man I'd ever seen, its proportions wrong in a way that triggered something deep and primal inside me. Its outlines suggested shoulders, a head, limbs, but they didn't move independently. The entire shape glided forward as one, smooth and relentless. Still no sound. I froze, every muscle locked, my mind screaming at my body to do something. Run, scream, pray. But my feet stayed rooted to the trail. The thing moved closer, staying just at the edge of illumination, and I realized with a sick lurch that it wasn't avoiding the light. It simply didn't exist fully within it. As it drew nearer, the forest reacted. Branches bowed inward without breaking. Leaves curled in on themselves as if shrinking away from an unseen heat. The air between us felt thick, resistant, pressing against my chest until breathing became an effort. I thought of my father then, of the way he used to stop mid-step on these trails, head cocked, listening. "The woods talk," he'd said once. Not with words, with patterns. And when the patterns break, you leave. I hadn't left. I'd stayed too long, trusted familiarity over instinct, memory over warning. The thing halted a few yards away, its shape blurring and sharpening in uneven pulses. And then, for the first time since I'd noticed it, it did something that shattered what little control I had left. It turned its head. There were no eyes, no mouth, no features I could point to. But I felt its attention lock onto me with crushing intensity, as if it were examining something it had already decided belonged to it. My ears rang, a high, piercing tone that drowned out thought. My vision narrowed, the edges darkening. And inside my head, not as a voice, not as words, but as a certainty I understood that it knew me. Not my name, not my face, my history, my memories of this place, my father's footsteps layered over my own, the years I'd come back seeking comfort, claiming ownership of something that was never meant to be owned. It knew all of it, and it felt patient. The fear changed then. It wasn't sharp anymore, it was heavy, settling, the kind that makes you realize escape isn't guaranteed, that survival might depend on something other than speed or strength. I forced my body to move, dragging one foot back, then the other, never turning my back fully on the thing. My hand shook as I reached for the small can of bear spray clipped to my pack strap. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if it would make things worse. But doing nothing felt like surrender. The nozzle hissed loudly when I tested it, the sound shockingly bright in the dead air. The reaction was immediate. The forest recoiled. Leaves trembled violently. The temperature spiked, then plunged. The shape wavered, its outline fracturing into overlapping silhouettes that slid out of sync with one another. The pressure in my chest eased just enough for me to gasp. I didn't aim. I didn't hesitate. I sprayed. The orange mist burst into the space between us, catching the beam of my headlamp in a fiery cloud. The smell of capsaicin burned my nose, my eyes, my throat. I coughed hard, stumbling backward, nearly losing my footing on the uneven trail. The thing did not scream. It did not flinch. But it stepped back, just one smooth, soundless glide, retreating into the trees without disturbing a single branch. The mist hung in the air, swirling uselessly where it had been, and then the forest rushed back all at once. Crickets, wind, distant life exploding into sound so loud it made me dizzy. I ran. I didn't stop until the trailhead lights came into view, until gravel crunched under my boots, and the dark thinned enough to feel survivable again. I didn't slow until I reached my RV, fumbling with the door, slamming it shut behind me with shaking hands. Inside, I collapsed against the counter, gasping, eyes burning, heart trying to break free of my ribs. I waited for footsteps, for shadows passing the windows, for the silence to press in again. Nothing came. But as I sat there, shaking in the dim interior light, one thought settled over me with awful clarity. It had let me go. And I didn't know why. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the dinette with my back against the wall, headlamp still strapped to my forehead like a useless talisman, listening to every sound the RV made as it cooled, the ticking of metal, the faint hum of the battery, wind brushing against the side panels like cautious fingers. Each noise arrived with a question attached to it, and none of them ever answered. Sometime after midnight, I noticed the smell again. It crept in slowly, so faint at first I thought it was memory leaking into the present. Damp stone, cold iron, the same wrongness that had followed me on the trail. I checked the windows, the vents, the door seal. Everything was shut tight. The air inside the RV was still, heavy with my own breath and fear, and yet the smell lingered, threading through the space as if it didn't need an opening. I told myself it was clinging to my clothes, to my hair, to my skin. I stripped down to my undershirt, stuffing my jacket and shirt into a plastic bin, sealing it as best I could. The smell faded, just enough for me to convince myself I'd solved the problem, just enough for denial to creep back in and take the edge off the panic. By dawn, exhaustion won. When I woke, sunlight filtered weakly through the trees, the forest looking almost apologetic in the morning haze. Birds hopped near the trailhead sign. A hiker's car pulled in as if nothing had happened. I made coffee with hands that still trembled, telling myself that night hiking had played tricks on my senses, that fear had filled in gaps my eyes couldn't. I left early, tires crunching over gravel, the smokies receding in my mirrors. I didn't go back for years. Life moved on the way it always does when you let it. Work, miles, new campgrounds, different forests with different moods. I stuck to places with wider skies, more people, fewer shadows. I told the story a few times, always softening the edges, turning it into something almost humorous. Probably just fatigue, I'd say. Your mind can do strange things in the dark. But there were moments, quiet ones, alone, when I'd catch myself listening for footsteps that weren't there, gauging the space just beyond my line of sight. Moments when silence felt less like peace and more like anticipation. 5 years later, I found myself back in North Carolina for a family matter that couldn't be avoided. My father's old property was being sold, and I was asked to clear out the remaining tools from a shed he'd built himself. It sat at the edge of the woods, the Smokies rising blue and distant beyond the tree line. I worked until evening, sorting rusted nails and warped boards, trying not to think about how close I was to the trails I'd sworn off. The air cooled as the sun dropped, and with it came a familiar tension, subtle but unmistakable. Denial whispered that I was safe, that I wasn't on the trail, that daylight still lingered, but instinct, the one I'd ignored before, told me to leave. I locked the shed and turned toward my truck, and that's when I noticed the ground. No footprints. Not mine. Not anyone's. The dirt was smooth, undisturbed, as if nothing had walked there for years. Yet the smell was back, stronger than it had ever been, rolling over me in a wave that made my stomach twist. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The space behind me felt occupied, heavy with attention, the same pressure in my chest, the same wrongness in the air, and beneath it all, a realization that chilled me more than fear ever had. It hadn't followed me out of the woods that night. It had followed me home. I understood then why it had let me go, why it had stepped back when I fought, why it had retreated without anger or urgency. It wasn't hunting. It was waiting. Waiting for me to stop running. Waiting for me to pretend one last time that I could go back to the places I loved without consequence. Waiting for the moment I stood still long enough for the patterns to break again. I got in my truck and drove until the sun was gone, and then kept going, headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through the dark. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't slow when the road curved toward the mountains. I left the state before midnight, crossing a line I'd never cross back. Some places don't belong to us, no matter how long we've walked them. Some silences aren't empty, they're listening. And if you ever find yourself on a trail where your footsteps are the only sound you can hear, remember this. The moment you notice the quiet, it has already noticed you, and it never walks alone. The fog that morning didn't roll in. It waited, like it already knew I was coming. My name is Elliot Crane. I was 39 years old then, born and raised in western Pennsylvania. The kind of place where you learn early that the woods don't care about your confidence. I'd driven down overnight in my old Volkswagen Westphalia, the kind with faded blue paint and a pop-top roof that rattles like loose teeth when the wind picks up. I trusted that van more than most people. It had carried me through Utah deserts, Michigan snowstorms, and lonely stretches of Nevada where the radio gives up before you do. I parked just before dawn near a quiet access point off the Appalachian Trail, not far from Harper's Ferry. The plan was simple: coffee on the tailgate, a short hike to greet the morning, then back on the road by noon. I'd done this ritual dozens of times. Solitude, movement, reset. But that morning the air felt thick, like breathing through fabric. The fog clung low, heavy enough that my boots vanished below the ankles when I stepped out of the van. It smelled damp and old, not the clean mineral scent of morning mist, but something sour underneath, like wet leaves that had been rotting for too long. I remember thinking it felt used, like this fog had already been somewhere else before it settled here. Still, I told myself, it was just Appalachia being Appalachia. I locked the van, slung my pack over one shoulder, and stepped onto the trail at 6:41 a.m. I checked my watch because I always check my watch when something feels off. It's a bad habit, trying to anchor yourself to numbers when your instincts start drifting. The forest was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. No birds, no insects. Even my footsteps sounded muted, like the fog was swallowing sound before it could travel. The trail sloped gently downhill, and the farther I went, the thicker the fog became, until the world shrank to a tunnel of gray 10 feet in every direction. I remember feeling watched, not from one direction, but from everywhere, like the trees themselves were leaning in, curious. I told myself to keep walking. That's when I heard the laughter. At first, it was faint, almost imagined. A high, breathy sound that slipped in and out of hearing like a radio signal struggling to lock in. I stopped, heart stuttering, and listened. The laughter came again, children, unmistakably. 2 of them, maybe 3. Giggling in short bursts, playful, careless. It came from downhill. My first thought was irritation. Families wandered onto the trail all the time, especially near Harper's Ferry. Kids wake early, run ahead, get bored. It wasn't dangerous, just unexpected. Then one of them said my name. Elliot. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't playful. It was spoken softly, almost testing the shape of it. I froze. There is a specific kind of fear that comes when something knows you without being introduced. My skin prickled, cold spreading across my shoulders like water soaking through cloth. I stood there, breathing shallow, waiting for logic to catch up and explain it away. Probably another hiker, I muttered. Coincidence. I'd been wearing a name patch on my jacket earlier that morning at a gas station. Maybe someone saw it. Maybe my mind was filling in blanks. That's what denial sounds like. It's reasonable. Calm. Persuasive. I took a step forward. The laughter came again, closer this time, echoing strangely through the fog. It didn't bounce the way sound should. It felt like it was inside the mist, not traveling through it. "Come down here," a child's voice said. A girl, maybe 7 or 8. Sweet. Trusting. My mouth went dry. I called back, keeping my voice steady. "Hey, trail's fogged in. You kids okay down there?" No answer. Then I heard running, small feet slapping against wet ground, circling, not approaching, not retreating, just moving, like they were playing a game I couldn't see. The fog shifted. Shapes began to form, not bodies, not faces, but impressions. Swirls and eddies where the mist grew denser, like invisible hands pressing outward from within. One by one, handprints appeared, suspended in the fog at chest height. Perfectly shaped, small. Fingers splayed, palms flat, as if children were standing right in front of me, pressing against a glass wall I couldn't see. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on a root, barely keeping my balance. Every instinct screamed run, but another voice, older, quieter, held me in place. The voice that said, "If you panic, you'll make it worse. If you run blind in fog, you'll fall, break a leg, disappear." The laughter stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse. Then the fog began to move uphill, toward me. Not drifting, advancing. The temperature dropped fast, my breath turning sharp and visible. My fingers went numb inside my gloves. I backed away slowly, eyes locked on those hovering handprints as they faded one by one, like breath on a mirror evaporating. "Elliot," the voice said again. Closer now, right behind my ear. I spun around. Nothing. Just fog. Trees. Wet ground. That's when denial cracked. I turned and ran uphill, lungs burning, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. The trail twisted, vanished, reappeared. Roots grabbed at my boots. Branches scraped my face. Somewhere behind me I heard the sound of children running again, but now it wasn't playful. It was urgent. I burst out of the fog near the trailhead, nearly colliding with my van. I fumbled the keys, hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slammed it shut, and locked it again, even though I knew locks didn't mean much out here. I sat there, gasping, staring through the windshield as the fog rolled past the clearing, stopping just short of the van like it had hit an invisible boundary. The laughter came one last time, distant now, disappointed. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, listening to my own breathing, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined it all. An hour later, when a park ranger drove by, I flagged him down. His name was Thomas Reed, late 50s, tired eyes, the kind of man who'd seen too much to be easily surprised. I told him everything. The voices, the handprints, the fog. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he looked past me toward the trail, jaw tight. "There haven't been any children reported on that section," he said slowly. "Not for a long time." "How long?" I asked. He hesitated. "Over 20 years. He didn't explain further, just told me I'd done the right thing leaving when I did. As I drove away, the fog finally lifted, revealing the trail exactly as it should have been. Empty, harmless, ordinary. But I knew better, because sometimes the woods don't scare you to hurt you. Sometimes they scare you to teach you when to leave. I didn't go far that day. I told myself I was leaving West Virginia entirely, that I'd cross the state line, find a diner, sit under fluorescent lights until my hands stopped shaking. But fear has a way of hijacking reason without you noticing. Instead of heading straight out, I pulled into a small gravel turnout a few miles away, one of those unofficial spots where hikers sometimes rest. Old habit. I wanted to understand what had happened before I let myself be done with it. The Volkswagen ticked softly as it cooled, metal contracting, sounding too much like footsteps for my nerves. I kept the windows up even though the van smelled like damp canvas and old coffee. Outside, the fog was thinner here, shredded by sunlight, but I could still see it lingering in the low places, pooled like breath held too long. What unsettled me wasn't just the voices. It was how familiar they'd sounded. Not the tone, children always sound like children, but the cadence, the way my name had been spoken, as if whoever said it knew me, as if they'd practiced. I tried to eat a granola bar. Couldn't swallow it. My jaw felt locked, muscles tight from clenching without realizing it. That's when I noticed my hands. They were streaked with damp, gray smudges. Fog residue, I assumed at first. But when I wiped them on my jeans, the marks didn't smear like dirt or moisture. They faded unevenly, leaving behind faint outlines, almost like fingerprints, small ones. I scrubbed harder, heart thudding again until my skin burned and the marks disappeared completely. I laughed then, a short, brittle sound, because laughing felt safer than letting the other reactions surface. This is what happens when you hike alone too much, I told the empty van. Your brain fills the silence. I stayed there another 20 minutes before the need to move outweighed the fear of moving. I started the engine, pulled back onto the road, and pointed the van toward a campground farther north. Populated. Official. A place with picnic tables and posted rules and the illusion of control. By mid-morning, the sun was high enough that the fog seemed like a bad dream. The Appalachian ridgeline rolled green and solid beside the road. Birds returned. Traffic picked up. Every rational signal told me I was safe again. And that's when the smell came back. It slipped through the vents without warning, a cold, wet odor like creek water and old stone. The same sour note I'd noticed that morning, only stronger now, more deliberate. I checked the vents, the dashboard, even pulled over to inspect the engine, convinced something had crawled in and died. Nothing. The smell vanished as suddenly as it appeared. I drove on. The campground sat in a shallow valley bordered by trees, sunlight dappling the ground in a way that should have felt comforting. A few RVs were already set up. Families. Couples. Normal life. I parked, paid my fee, and backed into a site near the edge, not isolated but not crowded either. I told myself I needed to face the woods again, prove they hadn't broken something in me. That afternoon passed quietly enough. I made lunch, took notes in my journal, trying to write the experience down while it was fresh. But every time my pen reached the moment where the voices began, my hand hesitated. The words felt wrong on the page, inadequate, like describing fire to someone who'd never felt heat. As evening fell, the temperature dropped faster than expected. The campground emptied out as people retreated into tents and trailers. Smoke from campfires hung low, mixing with the cool air. I sat on the step of the van, watching shadows lengthen, telling myself the unease was just leftover adrenaline. Then, faintly from the tree line behind my sight, I heard it again. Laughter. Not close, not far, just present. I stood slowly, every muscle coiled. The sound wasn't coming from any particular direction. It drifted, slipping between trunks, bouncing where it shouldn't. I scanned the campground. No kids running loose, no silhouettes, no movement. "Hello?" I called, hating the way my voice cracked. The laughter stopped. A few seconds passed. 10, 20. Then something touched the van. Not a knock, not a scrape, a press. The side panel flexed inward slightly, metal groaning under gentle but steady pressure. I backed away, pulse roaring in my ears, staring at the smooth blue paint as a shape appeared. An impression pushing from the outside. A hand, small, clear. Fingers spread wide, another appeared beside it. Then another, higher this time, near the window. The glass fogged instantly where it was touched, blooming outward in cloudy circles. I felt trapped in my own body, breath shallow, legs refusing to move. Panic clawed up my spine, but my mind fought it, desperate for a rational explanation. Kids, someone's kids, playing a prank, but the campground was silent. No footsteps, no whispers, just the soft creak of metal under pressure and the sound of my own heart. "Stop," I whispered. "Please." The pressure eased. The handprints faded, leaving the van unmarred, untouched. No dents, no streaks, no proof. I didn't sleep that night. I sat upright in the driver's seat, keys in the ignition, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the windshield. Every sound became a threat. The pop of cooling metal, the rustle of leaves, the distant crack of a branch. Time stretched, each minute heavy and slow. Sometime after midnight, the fog returned. It rolled in low, silent, threading between campsites without disturbing the fires or the flags or the thin ropes marking boundaries. It ignored human order completely, flowing where it pleased, climbing where gravity said it shouldn't. From within it, I heard them walking. Not running now. Walking, measured, patient. The smell intensified, filling the van until my eyes watered. Cold seeped through the doors, numbing my feet despite the heater blasting uselessly. I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel, teeth chattering, trying to remember every rule I'd ever learned about surviving fear. Don't engage, don't follow, don't invite. "Elliot," they said together, their voices overlapping, wrong in their unity. "You left." Something in that accusation pierced deeper than the fear. Guilt. As if I'd abandoned them, as if I owed them something. That was the most dangerous moment, the instant where empathy threatened to override survival. Where part of me wanted to open the door, step out, see them clearly, understand. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood. "No," I said aloud, forcing the word through shaking lungs. "I'm not yours." The fog recoiled, not retreating, withdrawing, like a tide pulling back from shore. The voices faded with it, stretching thin until they snapped into silence. By morning, the campground looked normal again. Sunlight burned off the last traces of mist. People emerged, laughing, making coffee, unaware of how close the night had come to swallowing me whole. I left before anyone could ask questions. I didn't stop driving until West Virginia was far behind me and the mountains flattened into something less ancient, less watchful. Even then, I kept the radio on, the volume high, filling every corner of the van with human noise. I learned something on that trip, something no guidebook ever teaches. The wilderness doesn't always test your strength. Sometimes it tests your boundaries, and sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do out there is stay when every instinct tells you to go. I thought leaving West Virginia would end it. That belief lasted exactly 3 days. The first night after I crossed into Ohio, I slept in a rest area with the windows cracked and the radio murmuring low talk to keep the silence from settling too deep. I woke just before dawn with the taste of iron in my mouth and the certainty that I hadn't been alone in my dreams. There were no voices, no fog, just the echo of small footsteps pacing the perimeter of the van, back and forth, like children waiting for a door to open. The second night, I smelled wet stone again. I was parked outside a grocery store in Indiana, asphalt still warm from the day. The smell had no business being there. It didn't belong to pavement or traffic or the hum of refrigeration units behind the building. It belonged to shaded hollows and places sunlight never quite reaches. By the third night, I stopped pretending it was coincidence. I began to understand the real lesson of that morning on the trail. Not that I'd escaped, but that I'd been noticed. The realization settled into me slowly, heavy and cold. I'd always believed solitude was a shield, that if you moved quietly enough through the world, it would leave you alone. But some things don't hunt noise. They hunt attention, awareness, the moment you sense them and don't look away. I tried to ground myself in routine, drove only during daylight, parked near crowds, ate regular meals even when I wasn't hungry. I spoke to people at gas stations just to hear my name used by a normal adult voice. Every small human interaction felt like proof I still belonged on this side of whatever line I'd brushed against. Still, the fog followed. Not visibly, Not like it had on the trail. It followed in temperature, in the way the air would suddenly cool around the van while the world outside stayed warm, in the way condensation bloomed on the inside of the windshield, forming shapes that vanished when I blinked. One evening, somewhere in Illinois, I pulled into a quiet county campground, telling myself I couldn't spend the rest of my life running from trees. The place was flat, open, forgettable. Cornfields in the distance, no mountains, no ancient hollows. I chose a site near the entrance, close enough to the road that headlights passed every few minutes. Safety and visibility. That night, as the sky darkened, I heard them again. Not laughter this time, crying, soft, rhythmic, exhausted. It came from the far side of the field where the grass dipped into a shallow drainage ditch. I stood frozen by the van, heart hammering, every instinct at war with itself. Crying is harder to ignore than laughter. It demands response. It pulls at something older than fear. "They're not real," I whispered. "They're not real." The crying stopped. For a moment I felt relief. Then a small voice said, very close now, "You said you'd come back." My stomach dropped. "I never said that," I replied, my voice hoarse but steady. I wasn't sure who I was talking to anymore, whatever was out there or myself. "You're confusing me with someone else." Silence stretched between us. Then, "They all say that." The fog rose from the ditch in a thin, deliberate line, crawling toward the van like a living thing. It didn't spread. It aimed. I backed up until my shoulders hit metal, hands fumbling for the door handle. In that moment, something shifted inside me. Not panic, not denial, but a kind of grim clarity. Running hadn't worked. Ignoring hadn't worked. These things, children of something older or echoes of something lost, were bound to places, but they weren't limited by distance. They were limited by permission. I took a breath, steadying myself, and spoke into the cooling air. "I'm not your keeper," I said, "and I'm not your way out." The fog hesitated. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," I continued, every word measured, "but I won't follow you. I won't carry you with me." The crying returned, sharper now, edged with anger. The fog surged forward, pressing against the van, seeping around the tires, curling up the doors. Handprints appeared again, this time on the inside of the glass, as if the barrier had reversed. I closed my eyes and waited. I don't know how long it lasted, minutes, hours. Time thinned the way it does when fear and resolve collide. When I finally opened my eyes, the fog was gone. The field lay empty. Still, I slept in the driver's seat until morning. After that night, the encounters stopped escalating. The fog no longer pressed, the voices no longer called my name. But something had changed, all the same. The silence they left behind wasn't relief, it was distance, like a door closing somewhere deep underground. I went home after that, parked the Volkswagen in my driveway, and didn't touch it for weeks. Friends asked about my trip. I told them it was quiet, beautiful. I learned something about myself. That part was true. Because here's what I know now. What the Appalachian Trail taught me at 6:41 a.m., wrapped in fog and children's voices. The wilderness isn't empty. It remembers. It remembers footsteps that never came back. Names spoken once and never again. Laughter that vanished into ravines and hollows where no one thought to listen. And sometimes when the conditions are right, when the fog is thick and the morning is young, it reaches out not to harm but to be acknowledged. The danger isn't in hearing it. The danger is answering. I still camp, still drive long roads, still wake before dawn to watch the world come alive. But when the fog rolls in now, I don't step into it. I wait, because some paths don't lead forward. Some paths only want company. The night stopped breathing, the moment I realized the woods were listening. My name is Ethan Crowell. I was 38 years old when this happened. A Georgia local who'd spent most of his adult life convincing himself that the wilderness was honest, brutal sometimes, unforgiving often, but never deceptive. I'd grown up camping, learned to read weather by smell, learned the difference between fear that saves you and fear that lies to you. Or at least I thought I had. That night on the Appalachian Trail near Blood Mountain, I learned how wrong a man can be about the land he thinks he knows. I'd parked my old Volkswagen camper, a faded green Vanagon I'd rebuilt with my own hands, at a trail access lot just before dusk. The plan was simple. 2 nights on the trail, solo, light pack, journal my thoughts like I used to when life felt less crowded. I told myself I needed quiet. What I didn't admit was that I needed distance from work, from people, from the dull, constant noise of being expected to be fine. The trail climbed fast. Blood Mountain always does. The air cooled early, the kind of cool that sinks into your wrists and throat before you notice it anywhere else. By the time I reached a small backcountry campsite just off the main trail, the forest had already shifted moods. Cicadas went silent in uneven waves, wind threaded through the trees without ever touching the ground. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. I set up camp with the practiced calm of muscle memory. Tent staked, fire ring cleared, pack hung, everything where it should be. Control is comforting when you're alone. Order feels like protection. I ate cold food, barely tasted it. The smell of damp leaves and old stone carried something faint underneath. Iron, maybe, or rot. I told myself it was just the mountain. Blood Mountain has a way of reminding you why it earned its name. I lit a small fire, more for the ritual than the warmth. The flames didn't crackle much. They bent low as if pressed by something unseen. Smoke drifted sideways, straight into the trees, refusing to rise. That was when I noticed the journal. It lay open beside the fire ring, its pages pale in the firelight, as if someone had set it down carefully, intentionally. Not old, not weathered. The cover was a soft brown leather, clean, with no trail dirt ground into the seams. It didn't belong there. I didn't touch it right away. There's a moment when your instincts speak quietly before fear takes over. That moment came and went, and I ignored it. I told myself someone must have left it behind earlier that day. Hikers pass through Blood Mountain constantly. People forget things. Still, the ink on the page glistened, wet. I leaned closer, heart slowing instead of speeding up, a dangerous calm settling over me. The entry was dated yesterday. The handwriting was neat, careful, the kind of writing someone uses when they want to be understood. I can hear it pacing just outside the firelight. The entry read, "It doesn't come closer. It just waits. I think it knows I'm watching." I felt a chill along my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I scanned the campsite. The tree line was dense, black beyond the reach of the fire. No footsteps, no movement, just the slow, breathing quiet of a mountain that never truly sleeps. I told myself it was a story, a prank, trail theatrics. People leave notes all the time, warnings about bears, water sources, bad weather. Someone had gotten creative. I closed the journal and placed it on a rock away from the fire. The woods exhaled. I didn't notice I'd been holding my breath until then. I crawled into my tent around midnight. Sleep came in fragments, half dreams stitched together by sound, a branch snapping too cleanly, leaves shifting without wind. Once I thought I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling just beyond the tent wall. I told myself it was a deer. Then I told myself it was raccoons. Then I stopped telling myself anything at all. At 2:04 a.m., my eyes snapped open. The fire was gone. Not embers. Gone. Darkness pressed against the tent like a physical thing. The air felt thicker, colder, as if the temperature had dropped all at once. My skin prickled, every nerve suddenly awake. I don't know what woke me. There was no sound. That was the problem. I reached for my headlamp, hands clumsy, heart now hammering hard enough to feel in my teeth. When the beam clicked on, the forest rushed back into existence in sharp, blinding slices of white. And that's when I saw the eyes. They reflected the light from deep within the trees, farther back than the edge of the campsite, higher than any deer's gaze should be. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They watched. A cold pressure settled in my chest, heavy and slow, like something lowering itself onto me from the inside. I stayed still, afraid that motion itself might be an invitation. Then I remembered the journal. I crawled out of the tent, every movement deliberate, painfully loud in my own ears. The campsite felt wrong without the fire, too open, too exposed. The journal still lay where I'd left it, open, I don't remember opening it. The last page was filled edge to edge with 3 words, written over and over, each repetition heavier than the last. The ink pressed so hard into the paper it nearly tore through. It followed me. It followed me. It followed me. My headlamp beam shook as I lifted it again, instinct dragging my eyes back toward the trees. The eyes were closer now, not rushing, not stalking, waiting. And in that moment, standing alone on Blood Mountain at 2:04 a.m., I understood something that would change the way I camp forever. The trail doesn't always want you there, and when it decides you don't belong, it doesn't have to chase you. Sometimes it just lets you know you're being kept. I didn't run. That's the part that still bothers me the most when I replay it in my head. How my body refused to obey the most basic survival instinct. I stood there with the journal, trembling my hands, staring into the dark as those eyes hovered just beyond certainty, just beyond proof. Too high, too still, positioned like something that understood patience better than hunger. The air carried a smell I hadn't noticed before. Wet metal and old bark, sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. It reminded me of the inside of a rusted toolbox left out in the rain too long. My breath fogged in front of me, uneven, loud in the silence. I whispered without meaning to. "Hey." The word fell flat, swallowed instantly by the trees. The eyes didn't react. That was worse than if they had. I backed toward my tent slowly, every step measured, trying not to break the invisible tension stretched between me and whatever was standing out there. The ground felt different under my boots, softer somehow, like the earth had been disturbed recently. When my heel sank slightly, a shiver went through me that had nothing to do with cold. I reached the tent and crouched, keeping the headlamp trained forward. My pack was right where I'd left it, but something about it looked wrong. The straps were twisted, not the way I'd packed them. The zipper hung open an inch. I knew I'd closed it. My mind tried to negotiate with reality. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you were tired. That quiet, reasonable voice had gotten me into trouble before. I ignored it now and opened the pack the rest of the way. The journal wasn't the only thing that didn't belong to me. Inside my pack, resting neatly on top of my spare clothes, was a strip of fabric. Gray. Frayed at the edges. It took a second for recognition to hit, and when it did, my stomach dropped. It matched the journal's cover. Someone had torn it off, recently. The woods shifted. Not footsteps. Weight. Pressure. Like the forest itself was leaning in, curious to see what I'd do next. The eyes moved, just slightly, gliding left without breaking their height, tracking me. I snapped the pack shut and stood, heart now racing hard enough to make my hands shake. Panic crept in the way it always does, not as a scream, but as a tightening, a narrowing of options. I thought of my van, parked miles downhill. I thought of the trail markers I'd passed on the way up, white blazes painted on trees that suddenly felt like breadcrumbs laid by someone who wanted you to wander. I turned off the headlamp. Darkness slammed down, thick and immediate. For half a second, I thought I'd made a mistake. Then my eyes adjusted just enough for the fire ring to glow faintly, a ghost of where warmth had been. And there, between 2 trees, I saw movement without reflection, a shape detaching itself from the dark. It didn't step forward. It unfolded. Limbs, too long, bending where joints shouldn't, lowered slowly, deliberately, until whatever it was stood closer to the ground. The smell intensified. My skin crawled with the certainty that I was being sized up, not for food, but for intent. That's when denial finally broke. This wasn't an animal. Animals rush or flee. This thing was waiting for me to decide. I backed away, then turned and ran. Branches tore at my arms. Roots grabbed my boots. I didn't follow the trail. I couldn't risk losing sight of the campsite markers I'd memorized. My lungs burned as the temperature dropped even further, breath ripping in and out of me like something borrowed. Behind me, I heard it. Not footsteps. Breathing. Slow. Controlled. Close enough that I could feel it on the back of my neck, a damp warmth that didn't match the cold air around us. It didn't chase. It didn't need to. Every time I slowed, it slowed. Every time I stumbled, it waited until I was back on my feet. It wanted me aware. I burst through brush and into another clearing, smaller, tighter, ringed with trees so close together they blocked the sky. My foot caught on something and I went down hard, knocking the air out of my chest. Pain flared up my ribs as I rolled onto my back, staring up through the branches. The stars were gone, not clouds. Gone. The sky above the clearing was black and flat like a ceiling. The smell was overwhelming now, metallic and damp, mixed with something sour that made my eyes water. I scrambled upright and my hand closed around a hanging object. A pack. Not mine. It was suspended from a branch, swaying gently as if recently disturbed. I didn't want to look inside. I already knew. But the zipper was half open, and something pale pressed against the fabric from within. I pulled it open and immediately regretted it. Inside were pages. Torn. Stuffed in at odd angles. Journal pages, their edges curled, ink smeared as if by wet fingers. I pulled one free and read by instinct rather than light. "I think it learns you," the page said. "I think it practices." A sound came from behind me, a wet, deliberate shifting, like weight transferring from limb to limb. I turned slowly. It stood at the edge of the clearing now, fully visible in silhouette, taller than I'd thought, narrow. Its head tilted slightly, not in curiosity, but in adjustment, as if aligning itself with me. I felt something inside me crack. "Take it," I said hoarsely, dropping the pages. "I don't want it." The thing didn't move. Then, from somewhere to my left, came a new sound. A voice. My voice. "Ethan," it said softly. Perfectly. The way my sister used to say my name when she wanted my attention without raising her voice. The way it sounded when it carried trust. That was when panic finally took over. I bolted, not caring where, crashing through undergrowth, the sound of my own name following me, not shouted, not repeated, just spoken once, like a promise. The trail appeared suddenly under my feet, white blaze glowing faintly in my headlamp beam as I flicked it back on. The eyes appeared again, closer than ever, flanking the trail now instead of blocking it, letting me pass. I ran downhill until my legs gave out, lungs screaming, vision tunneling. When I finally burst out onto the gravel lot where my van waited, dawn was just beginning to bruise the horizon. The forest stopped at the tree line. It didn't follow me out. I locked myself inside the van and sat there shaking until full daylight. I didn't drive right away. I couldn't. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. On the passenger seat lay something that hadn't been there before. A strip of gray leather, folded carefully. I didn't touch the leather. It sat on the passenger seat like a deliberate insult to daylight, its gray surface dull and lifeless in the growing morning sun. For a long time, I just stared at it, listening to my own breathing echo inside the van. Every instinct told me to throw it out the window, to drive until the mountains flattened into memory, to convince myself that fear was just exhaustion wearing a mask. But fear doesn't fold things neatly. Eventually, I started the engine. The old Volkswagen shuddered awake, familiar and imperfect, a sound I'd trusted for years. As I pulled away from the lot, I watched the tree line in the rearview mirror. It stood still. Too still. The forest didn't recede the way it should. It simply ended, as if it had never intended to follow beyond that boundary. The drive down the mountain felt longer than it should have. My body shook in delayed waves, adrenaline draining out of me like poison. The smell lingered in the van, metallic, wet, impossible. I rolled the windows down, letting cold air burn my face, grounding me in something real. By the time I reached the ranger station, the sun was fully up. Normalcy felt obscene. Birds sang. A couple laughed near the trailhead. A man adjusted his pack straps with the casual confidence of someone who believed the woods were predictable. I almost warned him. The ranger on duty listened without interrupting. He didn't smile, didn't dismiss me, didn't reach for a clipboard. When I finished, he nodded once and asked me to describe the journal. When I told him about the leather cover, the handwriting, the repeated words, something flickered behind his eyes. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "And you won't be the last." He told me they'd found journals before. Packs, too. Campsites abandoned without signs of struggle, fires cold, gear intact, footprints that stopped abruptly as if the person had simply decided to vanish. Blood Mountain had stories older than the trail itself, stories people learned not to repeat too loudly. Most folks who see it, the ranger continued, never realize what they're looking at. The ones who do, they leave something behind or take something with them. I thought of the leather strip. My stomach tightened. I drove home in silence. Didn't turn on the radio. Didn't answer my phone. Every shadow along the road felt like a test, every bend a question. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the relief was so intense it hurt. Walls, doors, locks, the illusion of separation. Inside my house, I set the leather on the kitchen table and backed away. It smelled stronger indoors, as if warmth woke something dormant inside it. I wrapped it in plastic, then sealed it in a metal toolbox and shoved it into the far corner of my garage. That night, sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it brought dreams of standing still while the world adjusted around me. Trees bending inward, stars blinking out one by one, my own voice calling from somewhere behind my eyes. I woke just after 2:04 a.m., heart racing, sheets damp with sweat. That became a pattern. Every night for weeks, I woke at the same time. Sometimes I heard breathing. Sometimes I smelled damp iron. Once, I found my trail boots moved from the closet to the front door, laces tied neatly together. I stopped camping after that. Not because I hated the wilderness, but because I finally respected it. There's a difference. I started reading old trail accounts, journals scanned and archived online, stories dismissed as folklore. The patterns emerged slowly, like shapes in fog. People who ignored instincts, people who stayed one night too long. People who believed solitude was the same as safety. I burned my own trail journal in the backyard one evening, watching the pages curl and blacken, the words disappearing into ash. It felt necessary, like closing a door that had been left ajar too long. Months passed. The waking stopped. The smells faded. I began to believe I'd escaped with more than most. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived, no return address. Brown paper. Light. Inside was a notebook. Leather-bound. Grank. Except for the first page. I watched you leave. It read, "You learned. I don't know where it is now. I don't remember putting it anywhere." Sometimes I think that's the point. The trail doesn't need you to be afraid forever. It just needs you to remember. I tell this story now because people romanticize camping in America. They talk about freedom, isolation, the idea that nature is a place you conquer or consume. But the truth is quieter and more dangerous. The wilderness doesn't care who you are, and sometimes it notices you too much. If you camp, really camp, listen to the moments when the woods go still. Trust the discomfort that doesn't have a name yet. Leave when something tells you to leave, even if you can't explain it. Especially then. Some trails don't end when you step off them. Some entries don't stay written on the page, and some things on Blood Mountain are still watching, patient, learning, waiting for the next person who believes the forest is only a backdrop and not a witness. Because the last entry in the trail journal is never the last thing written. It's just the last thing you remember writing.